Richard Nixon was the 37th President of the United States, beginning his term in January 1968. He preached to end the Vietnam War with peace and to end the current stagflation rates in the nation. However, Nixon's presidency is plagued by the acts of suspicion, illegal activities, and corruption. A rise in ultimate suspicion for President Nixon was a leak of the Pentagon Papers in 1971. These papers held secrets and proved that presidents such as Truman and Johnson had intentionally expanded their Vietnam War efforts, in contrast to what the American people were told. The release of these papers into the media caused frenzy and a panic in the Nixon administration, which created a covert group to cover up leaks. Nixon advisor John Eckelman assembled the White House plumbers to help cover these leaks. Soon after, Nixon's rivals were recorded onto his enemies list, which was a list of politicians, journalists, and even movie stars who Nixon found as a threat to his re-election as president. His administration harassed such people with tax audits and legal actions, and such suspicions also led to Nixon bugging political opponents or those he's found untrustworthy. However, his biggest mistake was the cover-up of the break-in of the Watergate complex, which became known as the Watergate scandal. The Watergate scandal began with the break-in by 5 burglars into the Democratic Party's National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. on June 17, 1972. They were arrested at 2:30 a.m., and one of the men was a Republican Party aide, leaving questions as to whether the Nixon administration was involved.
The committee is trying to solve a spy mystery. It began before dawn Saturday when 5 intruders were captured by police inside the offices of the committee in Washington.
However, they denied any. But emerging clues said otherwise. On August 1st, 1972, a $25,000 cashier's check, apparently earmarked for Nixon's campaign, ended up in one of the Watergate burglars' bank accounts, which heightened suspicions. Following this, on October 10, 1972, the Federal Bureau of Investigations reported the cash found stolen by the 5 burglars had been in connection with the slush fund used by the Committee for Re-election of the President. However, even with tensions of the Watergate affair building, Richard Nixon was re-elected on November 7, 1973, in the biggest landslide election in American history. At this time, all involved directly with the scandal were implicated, and at the end of January 1963, 2 former Nixon aides were convicted for wiretapping and burglary, and in April 1973, Nixon's top White House staffs, H.R. Hadelman, John Eckelman, and Richard Clendenstein, resigned over the scandal while White House counsel John Dean was fired. In the spring of 1973, the Watergate trial began, which was publicly televised and broadcasted.
Appalling to me is that the president, when this whole idea was suggested to him, didn't in righteous indignation rise up and say, "Get out of here, you're in the office of the President of the United States. How can you talk about blackmail and bribery and keeping witnesses silent?"
And led by Senator Sam Irving and Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox. These 2 men helped find the connection between the White House creep and the Watergate burglary. During trial, former White House counsel John Dean suggested that he and Nixon had discussed the Watergate scandal over 35 times and knew of the cover-up. Also, Alexander Butterfield, the former presidential appointment secretary, revealed in his testimony that since 1971, Nixon recorded all conversations and telephone calls in his offices, including conversations regarding the Watergate scandal.
Did you know about the burglary of our Democratic National Headquarters at the Watergate?
At this time, Nixon ordered the removal of all wiretapping and recording devices in the White House, and the Supreme Court began to narrow in on Nixon and his involvement with the Watergate break-in. In 1973, the Supreme Court demanded that all recorded tapes be handed over to the government officials. Nixon refused to hand over any of the tapes to anyone, citing executive privilege.
This principle of confidentiality of presidential conversations is at stake in the question of these tapes. I must and I shall oppose any efforts to destroy this principle, which is so vital to the conduct of this great office.
The following months, the trial continued, and then on October 20th, 1973, Saturday Night Massacre occurred. Nixon fired Archibald Cox and made Attorney General Richardson and Deputy Attorney General William D. Ruckelshaus resign. This caused public outcry and increased pressure for impeachment in Congress. Richard Nixon responded with his press conference in November 1973, his most famous quote being, "I am not a crook."
And I want to say this to the television audience. I made my mistakes, but in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent. And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I could say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
In March of 1974, all 7 criminals were indicted, and even though Nixon was on the list, he remained unindicted. Shortly before this, Nixon finally handed over some of the tapes, but the famous unknown 18 gap was found with no explanation. In April of 1974, the Supreme Court released over 1,200 pages of transcripts of the Nixon tapes and demanded Nixon release over 64 conversations and recordings from the White House. In July 1974, the smoking gun tape was released. It was a conversation between Nixon and Chief of Staff H.R. Hadelman on June 23, 1972. In the tape, Nixon agrees that administration officials should approach Richard Helms, the former director of the CIA, and Vernon A. Walters, deputy director, and ask them to request L. Patrick Gray, acting director of the FBI, to halt the Bureau's investigation into the Watergate break-in on the grounds that it was a national security matter. With this information leaked, the special prosecutor felt that Nixon had entered into a criminal conspiracy whose goal was obstruction of justice. In July 1974, the House Judiciary Committee passed one of 3 articles required for charging obstruction of justice towards Nixon. This threat ultimately led to Richard Nixon becoming the first and only president to resign on August 8, 1974, and was succeeded by Gerald Ford.
Throughout the long and difficult period of Watergate, I have felt it was my duty to persevere, to make every possible effort to complete the term of office. America needs a full-time president and a full-time Congress. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour.
A month later, Ford pardoned Nixon in his involvements in the Watergate scandal, jeopardizing Ford's presidency from the beginning and leaving suspicions of whether a deal was made between them. It is not a question, though, to say that since Watergate, our whole entire political landscape has changed, and now America leads a political history riddled with corruption and distrust.